We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the spiritually curious. This is a very significant portion of the American population, and oftentimes we don't really know how to approach them. We oftentimes talk about evangelism and apologetics here, and a lot of our apologetics are really geared towards people that are agnostic or atheist. These people are a little bit more open to those ideas. They may be spiritually curious, and so that's why we want to spend some time today talking about this book. It's been out a couple of months, Faith for the Curious. It is written by Mark Matlock, and he is the executive director of Urbana 2025 for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Also, a senior fellow at Barna, and Barna Research is a group that we, of course, talked about many times in the past. He's the founder of Wisdom Works, which has helped national, international faith-based organizations adapt to some of the changes taking place. You may be familiar with him with his previous book, co-authored with Dave Kinnaman, Faith for Exiles. This one, Faith for the Curious, and the foreword by David Kinnaman. Mark Matlock, welcome to Point of View.
Hey, great to be with you today.
Let's, if we can, maybe kind of get into some of this for those who are listeners to Point of View, especially those who give to the Truth Team. I'm holding up right now the May booklet that I created, which was all about individuals who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, and we get into some of those ideas which are oftentimes identified by certain people working in the field. Certainly Pew Research and others have even given them a designation that actually is SBNR, spiritual but not religious. In some respects, I think some of these people that are, if you will, the curious, the faithful, curious individuals, are individuals that are spiritually open, but certainly aren't plugged into a church. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities between the group you just mentioned. The one difference would be that we actually measured curiosity using a curiosity scale that looked at how actively people were seeking spiritual things. So we actually narrow that group down just a little bit in terms of how much they're leaning into understanding the spiritual world around them versus maybe being more passive about it.
Well, let's, if we can, kind of define the terms, because first of all, we recognize that church identity is on the decline. The rise of the unaffiliated, oftentimes called the spiritual nuns, has been on the increase. And so 2 in 5 U.S. adults are non-practicing Christians. Now, when you get to spiritual curiosity, as you point out, you actually looked at this curiosity scale from those who have high curiosity, about 38%, those who have moderate curiosity, another 38%, and then those who have low curiosity. And you really identified a couple of people, curious skeptics and spiritually curious. Can you kind of explain who those are? Because in some respects, they're very close to one another, aren't they?
Yeah, they both believe that there is likely more out there. The spiritually curious definitely believe there is more out there. The curious skeptics believe there is, but they're not always convinced that they can know that for certain. And the spiritually curious are more they're more actively exploring spiritual practices. Curious skeptics are very much open to it, positive about it. They may not be as actively engaging in spiritual practices like tarot card reading, meditation and mindfulness, different kinds of things like that, crystals, things that we would associate with outside of, the biblical framework for how we engage the supernatural.
And one of the things that I wish I'd created this for the individuals watching online, but as you get the book, you can see that there is a graph and a chart. On the y-axis is curiosity. On the x-axis is supernaturalism. On the far left-hand side, you'd have the naturalists. These would be the atheists that are pretty much closed off to the belief in spiritual realm. One of the reasons why the most recent Lee Strobel book on spirituality has a first section to try to show individuals that there is a supernatural realm. There is more to life than life. But those would be on one extreme. The other extreme, of course, would be practicing Christians who believe in the supernatural and may have a higher level of curiosity. But in between, you've got the spiritually curious, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about. Those are people, I guess, that would not necessarily be part of the Christian church. They either are non-Christians or non-practicing Christians. And then the curious skeptics that are at least sort of open to the ideas. And in some respects, we have neglected those because we've sort of gone to one extreme or the other, haven't we? Sometimes, Mark, assuming either you're in the church, you're out. Either you're interested in Christianity or you're not. But I think this book is really an attempt to identify a very significant number of people in the middle who may be spiritually curious, maybe even curious skeptics, and those are the people we really need to reach out to.
Yeah, we're looking at about 67% of the unchurched population is in that spiritually curious realm. 74% of all Americans tell us that they would like to grow spiritually. So there's definitely an attitude that's very different than when we're thinking about that 10% that we call the naturalists in the Faith of the Curious. That group is, but what I've found is that most Christians tend to think of the unchurched as that naturalist group, because a lot of our apologetics is written about that group. A lot of the way that sometimes we talk about or we see people that are hostile toward Christianity, they tend to belong in that group of people, and we miss the fact that there's this huge number of people, 67% of our population, that actually are kind of like, I'm exploring a spiritual upgrade. I think that's an important thing, too, that we found when we looked at the spiritually curious. And for the sake of the conversation, I'm going to include the spiritually curious and the skeptics, that 67%. I'm just going to include that into one group and not nitpick it for our time. But one of the things about that group is that they're looking for an upgrade. They've experienced something in their life, the image of God in them in some way. They're creative. They're experiencing intimacy. They're experiencing love, generosity, maybe a sense of injustice. And part of the image of God is showing up in them, but because of sin, they're not able to fully realize that. And they've figured out that money and education can't quite get them that far, so they're turning to spirituality and some kind of practice to hopefully mend that. Now, we know as Christians, the only way that you're really going to experience the image of God is to be fully renewed and transformed through faith in Jesus Christ and death and resurrection.
Let's take a break and we'll come back and get into that a little bit more detail, because I think it is worth mentioning. The book has been out for many months, published by our good friends at Baker Publishing. We have a link to markmatlock.com, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the common mistakes among Christians is to assume that the future will be merely an extension of the present. We need to understand some of the dynamic changes in our world. That is why I've written 2 books about American realignment and American political realignment. The former looks at demographic and economic changes that have taken place. The latter deals with government and political process. Recently, William Galston wrote about the American political realignment is real. He worked in numerous Democratic presidential campaigns and served as Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy for President Bill Clinton. His commentary to his fellow Democrats is that the Trump election may indeed be political realignment. For example, the Republican Party increased its vote share in 3 consecutive presidential elections in 1,400 counties, nearly half of the national total. By contrast, the Democratic Party increased its share of all 3 elections in only 57 counties. To illustrate the change, he looked deeper at 2 states, Texas and New York. Although Democrats dreamed of turning Texas blue, 124 counties have tilted further right since 2012, while only 2 counties have tilted further left. New York has long been a blue bastion. Nevertheless, 43 of the state's 62 counties showed Republican gains of 10 percentage points or more between 2012 and 2024, and Democrats' statewide victory margin shrunk by half. His commentary looks at other changes in the minority votes of Black and Hispanic that show similar shifts. A shift in voting in one election may not mean much, but his analysis suggests a significant shift and realignment in the future. Political candidates need to take note. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Mark Matlock. He is the author of this book, Faith for the Curious, forward by Dave Kinnaman. About 220 pages, 10 chapters, published by Baker. You can be looking for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to markmatlock.com. We also have a link to his Instagram post, as well as some other great information, including the book, which you could get in either hardback or Kindle. And Mark, you were talking about some of the aspects of that, and there's a section in which you talk about the spiritually curious and give us, 8 different characteristics. And that, I think, is helpful because sometimes people are so kind of locked into either they're a Christian or they're a non-Christian, and there's a whole group of individuals, matter of fact, seems to be an increasing group of individuals that have some openness to the supernatural, know that life seems to be a little bit missing something, and are curious and looking for that. And here is why you wrote the book, isn't it?
Yeah, I just started having lots of interactions with people going, what's going on here? And also noticing in our research at Barna for several different groups that, yeah, there was this group of Americans, a large group, that didn't seem to be behaving the way a lot of us typically think of when we think about the people that we might share our faith with, that they're a lot more open and receptive, but maybe the way we engage them needs to have a little bit different nuance than maybe some of the way we've traditionally done it.
And so, again, you're talking about spiritually curious ones, maybe don't have strong opinions about the supernatural, but believe it exists, open to experiences about the spiritual, maybe less inclined to be open to institutional religious experiences, which brings me to something I said in one of the other booklets on the next generation. We assume that if they're spiritually curious, they'll walk into the church, and I call that the field of dreams myth. You know, if you build it, they will come. We've built 350,000 churches in America. The spiritually curious aren't necessarily going to walk in the back door of the church, are they?
I think like 20 years ago, inviting somebody to church would bring them in. But now we have to assume that there's probably 4 or 5 other steps before they even get to that place that they were 20 years ago. And so thinking about that place of meeting people where they're at and having those conversations. It's more like Nicodemus, in the middle of the night meeting with Jesus, or like, Jesus meeting the woman at the well. These are going to be things where we're meeting people in the places where they actually live and engaging these conversations. And most people are very open to having conversations. They're not necessarily interested in us preaching at them or telling them what we believe, but most of them have a spiritual story, and getting them to talk about it often leads to deeper conversations where Jesus comes in and meets them.
Let's talk about the warnings for just a minute, and I'm going to pull from some of your earlier book, Faith for the Exiles, because one of the things there is you found that these individuals, which we'll call spiritually curious, need safety around doubts and questions. In other words, screens disciple, you said, and in some respects, there is not just less inclination to go to church, there's even a very significant hesitation, and you surfaced some of that in your earlier book, Faith for Exiles, didn't you?
Well, one of the things, we're even finding this with Urbana, is that students are actually doing a lot of pre-work before they engage us as people, right? Like they're researching mission organizations before they ever come up to the booth or the table. They're doing their homework because that's kind of the environment that they've been brought up in. And so they're asking a lot of questions into Google about their faith. And so one of the things that we have to realize, especially those of us that are, in older generations, we might use the internet, but we probably don't lean into it as much as this other generation does as an initial form of exploration. My doctor, when I visited him recently, said, "So what do you think you have?" when he first walked into the office. And I was like, "What do you mean? What do I think? I'm here to find out from you." And he goes, "Well, I know you've already Googled all your symptoms, right?" So I thought, what a wise doctor. And I think that we have to have the same approach when we encounter somebody, to realize that they've probably already been on a spiritual journey. And it would be helpful for us to find out what that is before we start making any assumptions. So curious kind of calls to curious. And if we're curious about a person's spiritual backstory, we may find lots of opportunity to help them continue to go on the path toward Christ that they're already on, probably.
Well, again, you already tipped to the other one I want to talk about, and that is the do-it-yourself, the DIY culture that we're in. And, of course, your doctor understood that, but that's really what we are in. We're in a DIY culture in which I not only am going to go on YouTube or Instagram or a variety of other places to find information, but I'm also kind of doing it my DIY faith, isn't it? And that's I think another thing you're talking about there at Urbana as well.
Yeah, well, I think, an important thing, on this DIY thing is this isn't necessarily that I'm building my own faith in my own image. It could lead to that, but that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm really talking about is this idea of agency, that I'm the one who's doing the constructing and the exploration. So, as I'm working with pastors that are asking me, how do I appeal to the spiritually curious as a pastor? We kind of are used to going and holding up and doing all this research and then coming and presenting our sermon that kind of pulls it all together. The spiritually curious actually would like to be in your study while you're putting the sermon together, looking at the books you're reading, seeing the notes you discarded as well as what they're interested in the process, and they want to be able to investigate on that level. And so it kind of opens up the opportunity for things like, I find with spiritually curious people, it's sometimes helpful for me to be a co-learner with them, even if I know the answer or think I know the answer, to say, hey, let's explore what Jesus might say about this together, as opposed to just telling them what I think the answer already is. They're much more interested in that journey and that process.
And they're open to newness and uncertainty, you talk about, because you have a very interesting graph here. Practicing Christians, I like to do things that are frightening or complex or challenging. No, they're always a little bit more reserved. But the spiritually curious, they're almost off the charts. And that is, yeah, I'm willing to do something that's unusual, frightening, unpredictable, challenging. And so in some respects, that desire for even a more intense experience is something that we've got to get used to as Christians dealing with this particular group of spiritually curious individuals.
You know, it's really interesting, but I found that, like, a lot of times we try to make church more palatable or easy for people. And what the spiritually curious, they're actually looking for more intensity, like you said. And like I found with a group of teenagers that were meeting in my home, we decided that we were going to explore and practice prayer together. And we were going to explore the way different Christians have learned to pray throughout the centuries. So we kind of went back and studied some of the old ways of the Desert Fathers and things like that. And I was shocked, but they invited their friends to come that weren't Christians. And I was like, wow, like here we're doing something that's very risky, that's very bold, that's very different, maybe even a little awkward at times. But they were inviting their friends to that more than they were, hey, come hang out, have snacks, and we're going to do a light, Bible study kind of a thing. So that was what kind of started making me wonder, boy, are we maybe missing it? That really they are looking for something that really is connected to power and to the real presence of God in their lives.
The book is entitled The Faith for the Curious. Mark Matlock is our guest. We'll take a break, and when we come back, spend a little bit more time digging into this book. If you'd like to know more about that, know more about him, go to our website at pointofview.net. Let me also mention that we do have our Anchored to Truth banner, because we are encouraging you as we come to the end of our fiscal year, which ends on June 30th, for you to join with us. And as we've mentioned before, one of the benefits of supporting this ministry monthly, you receive the monthly Outlook magazine. We'll be talking about this a little bit later when we talk about the axis of evil and what is going on in Iran right now. But also, I've mentioned some of those booklets. I mentioned one on false spirituality and the next generation. Probably do one on the spiritually curious as well. And so those are resources we make available to you. So your gift certainly is something that will help us to continue to bring these kinds of programs to you every single day. And there's a place where you can click on the button that says monthly or a single gift. If you join with us monthly, for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you'll be part of the Truth Team and receive these booklets that we send out each month right in your mail. So let's again encouraging you to join with us. And there's a match on the table, a dollar for dollar match. And you can go to the website right now, pointofview.net. We'll be back.
1972. Point of View was one of a kind, the first Christian conservative talk radio show bridging the gap between biblical values and political action. Over a half a century later, Point of View still stands unique. Consider this testimonial from David, a listener of Point of View. He said, "Point of View is the one place I can go that I can hear kindness addressing the difficult issues. You can speak the truth and still say it in the right way, and that's something I appreciate." When you support Point of View, you're equipping Americans to live out their biblical values and to speak truth boldly in the right way. Point of View needs your support right now. Will you donate generously before the end of our fiscal year, June 30th? Give today at pointofview.net or call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Mark Matlock. The book is entitled Faith for the Curious, forward by Dave Kinnaman. It is published by Baker, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But one of the things, Mark, that I thought might be helpful is early on, you talk about some of the mistakes we could make. The mistake that the search of the curious to be finite, the mistake that the curious are wanting to find an expert or authority, and that will solve the problem, or even mistakenly think that we need to close the deal or that we make it too difficult to trust in Jesus. It does seem to me that in some respects, we need to understand that we're dealing with people that are different than we are, and sometimes we need to sort of get out of our shell or out of our silo and begin to understand a little bit more about how they perceive the world and what kind of information or relationships they might need.
Yes, I think, a lot of the ways that we've been trained to share our faith are great. They're designed to help us do it effectively, accurately, and efficiently, but sometimes not with our full self being present. And that's some of the mistakes that can be made, is knowing whether or not, we're always, it's all about bringing people to that point where we say, is there any reason why you couldn't trust Christ today? And I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have to be careful that we realize that because there are probably like 5 or 6 extra steps in the current time that we live in toward people being able to make a decision, that we're okay with the fact that we may not be the last stop on their spiritual journey. And that we might really be sensitive to what God is wanting to do in that moment with us as we're talking to them, and not feel like we need to close the deal. Sometimes with our family members, when we get together with our non-believing family members, we're always, see this is our opportunity to put that question of Jesus in front of them, and it becomes exhausting for them, and we all of a sudden don't have any broader basis of relationship. And I'm finding that it takes, 5, 6, maybe even a dozen or more interactions with somebody before I'm able to actually ask them if they're ready to trust Christ, or they are ready to trust Christ. So I think we have to kind of set our expectations a little bit differently. But there's nothing wrong with saying that. I just think we need to be careful.
I think so. And the middle chapters there talk about the curious culture and the curious posture. Can maybe you explain some of that? Because once we understand the people that we're dealing with, maybe we will then not be inclined to make some of the mistakes you talk about.
Yeah, a big part of it has to do with this idea of always making the assumption that maybe God is already at work before we even encounter them. So that we want to discover that, I think, is really, really important in terms of that. And I think we have to look at ourselves, too, in terms of, we can be in such a transactional culture, and faith in Christ is more than a transaction. It's a true relationship with Jesus Christ. And so we need to be careful that we don't treat it in a transactional way, and that our friendships and relationships with the spiritually curious aren't based on whether or not they make a decision to follow Jesus or not. And that means really connecting with them in a deeper way. We, in the church, have what we call a higher need for closure. Our research, we use the scale to measure that, which means, and there's nothing wrong with this. It's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. It's neutral, but it means that we have a lower tolerance for ambiguity, for uncertainty, the unknown. And the spiritually curious have a higher sense of that by about 20 percentage points. So we are going to be less comfortable with ambiguity, and we're going to want to bring certainty in maybe sooner than they are ready for that. And what's certain for us may seem oversimplistic to them. They may not be in that place to trust. And a great example of that is the the rich young ruler, he comes in and has this exchange with Jesus, and then he walks away. And I've always, been like, wow, Jesus didn't chase after him and say, hey, wait a minute. Let me keep, telling you what you need to know here. He kind of lets him go away. And I really believe one of the first things I'm going to do when I'm in heaven, by the way, it's on my top 5 list. I want to find out what happened to the rich young ruler, because I firmly believe that he came around and Jesus knew he has to process this to get to a point where he really can trust me with his whole life. And we need to be careful that we don't give such short answers to things or certainties to things that people are asking questions about, that we don't turn them off.
Yes. And again, I love that fact that you do have this cloture scale, which shows, again, that practicing Christians are more likely than any other faith group or even non-believing group to have a high need for closure or certainty, and that is the case. Let's, if we can, maybe just talk about how to engage the spiritually curious. And one of the more helpful sections, I thought, in that chapter had to do with defining sin, because sometimes, again, our definition and the way in which we try to communicate it isn't always biblical, but it certainly isn't helpful. Can you explain maybe?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting, Kerby, is if you ask a spiritually curious person, what do you think happens when you die? Half of them tell us that they believe that they will be accountable to God or a higher power for the way that they live their life. So, you've got a 1 out of 2 chance when you're talking to a person who's outside of the church that they actually feel morally responsible for the way that they're living their lives with some kind of eternal afterlife sense. So helping people understand what they believe sin is. We think of sins as a list of behaviors, but it's really our condition. And a lot of people outside of the church have come to know sin as specific behaviors and actions, and not necessarily a general condition that we're all born into. So helping people work through that and understand that. And I find that by just asking people questions about, do you believe that man is good or bad? What do you believe? You believe that we're accountable for the way we live our life? Will there be consequences, for the way that we live? Asking those kind of questions really pulls out of people what they believe or what they've never really thought much about, but maybe have some opinions on. That's a great way to be able to then talk about what the Lord believes, because most of the time people will say, well, what do you think? What do you believe? And that gives us an opportunity to share at their invitation, which is nice.
Yes. Well, another part of that is you talk about, and again, some of the surveys and the statistics that you have show that, again, this issue of judgment is certainly front of mind. They would like to listen without judgment. They imagine a Christian who would be interested in learning from, that you're going to be less judgmental, not trying to force a conclusion, somebody who really is willing to understand me, maybe experiences some of these struggles, even demonstrates an interest in you. And that's, of course, what we've tried to teach people, but sometimes when it comes down to the rote way in which we oftentimes teach and treat evangelism, it doesn't come off that way, but that's certainly what you would expect a non-Christian or a spiritually curious individual to say about the interaction they would have with another Christian.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, and I can't remember a time when I didn't go to church. I literally believe maybe my mom gave birth to me in a pew during a service. But it was only when I was in high school, as I was reading the Bible, that I realized that while I stood and believed the things that Jesus stood for and believed to a certain extent to what I was capable of, I wasn't affecting people. I didn't have the same effect on people that Jesus had, where people were following him. People wanted to be around him. People were bringing really deep problems to him. And I thought, what is it about me that's preventing that from happening? Why am I not being thought at in the way that Jesus? And that's when I realized that, if you miss Jesus the heart of Jesus by just a degree, you're way off. And the Pharisees, who were probably the most like him theologically, in terms of their goals of holy living, many of them missed him when he was there in their midst. And so I really want us to think about, how am I affecting people in the way that Jesus affected people? That's really, I think, what's at the heart of all of this.
Yes.
And what people said they wanted out of spiritual conversations. Jesus sometimes, didn't land the plane for people. He didn't explain it all with certainty. Left them sometimes, even more confused. But ultimately, that led them to him.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Mark Matlock right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Conversation today about Faith for the Curious, which is, again, a book published by Baker, 220 pages, 10 chapters, written by Mark Matlock. And let's, if we can, talk about the supernatural. A minute ago, I mentioned Lee Strobel, in his book, talks in that first half about the supernatural for the atheist or the agnostic or the skeptic. But the rest of it, I think, illustrated by the subtitle of his book, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters. the unseen world. And if I think about this, Mark, this goes back to one of the research projects you did with Barna on teens and the supernatural, in which you found that a lot of these teenagers, even at a time when you had the Harry Potter books, the Harry Potter movies, you had all sorts of issues about the supernatural, not much was communicated from the pulpit, you found. And if you look at your chart here, the spiritually curious are quite likely to have read or looked at a horoscope, to have witnessed a miracle, to have their fortune told, to have their palm read, maybe to have used crystals and a variety of other things. So when we get into this issue of the supernatural, we may not necessarily be trying to convince them of the supernatural. We may really be trying to warn them about the dangers of it, and to say that you're looking for the supernatural, but you may be looking in the wrong place, don't you think?
Well, yeah, it's kind of like when the Apostle Paul was standing on Mars Hill, where I actually was just there in Athens a couple of weeks ago, and he says, "I see that you are a very religious people," and he admires them for their spiritual prowess. And I think sometimes when we hear about people that are experimenting with crystals and things like that, we tend to evaluate them, and judge them and look negatively upon what they're doing or whatever, rather than saying, hey, you're really into this. What are you looking for when you're doing this? What are you hoping to find?
Right.
And connecting with that, and then showing how Jesus is a much better answer than maybe the tarot cards or the stars in the sky. Hey, I'll introduce you to the one who put the stars in the sky. And so I think there's something about that that's really important, that we think about how we react to that.
Well, and again, you've got some great charts here. More than half of the spiritually curious have had a supernatural experience. Half of spiritually curious individuals have a traditional view of God, which I think most people were maybe a little bit surprised. And then back to that issue of ambiguity, the curious are content without answers. So in some respects, mindfulness, meditation, maybe even interacting at that level is maybe a different kind of evangelism, a different kind of apologetic. And in some respects, that's exactly why you wrote this book.
Yeah. I really was looking to help the church connect to the spiritual moment the broader culture seems to be in, and figure out how to use where people are at to bring them and introduce them to Jesus. And I think that's, the key reason I wrote the book. I just saw a lot of my fellow Christians, and even myself to some extent, struggling with how to understand where people were coming from. And I find that some of this framing and this thinking helps us just think a little bit differently about the people that we're engaging in, maybe takes a little bit of the fear out of talking about these things with people, because we find they're more open to talking about them. In fact, I find men really love talking about spiritual things. In fact, when I would go to neighborhood parties, my wife would always be like, stop talking about, you're always talking about spiritual things when we go to these, they're going to stop and buy. I'm like, honey, I'm not bringing it up. They want to talk about it. They're coming to me with the thoughts and the questions and the conversation. And so I think we forget that people don't have a lot of places to have some of these conversations. And as long as we're willing to have an open conversation that isn't, once again, trying to drive to that conclusion, most people are willing to engage. In fact, I find most people that are spiritually curious ask me how they can follow Jesus or what that looks like, than me ever having to even open that door or ask that question, because they become very interested in it.
Let's just, before we go, first of all, mention that the book is available and people can find it in the bookstore, but also we have a link there to get it in hardback or Kindle. We also have a link to markmatlock.com. You are the wisdom hacker, as it says. And if people would like to get your blog, or they would like to get your subscription to some of the resources that you have available, and this would certainly get them started also on the journey that comes from the books, Faith for Exiles and Faith for the Curious, that's available at the website. But explain to people what they might be signing up for.
I'd also recommend that people go to faithforthecurious.com.
Sure.
You can actually download a sample chapter from the book, and there's other resources available there for people who want that. But I do infrequent mailings of things that I'm working on, things that I'm learning, to those that are interested in following those things. So that's kind of what I make available there at markmatlock.com.
Well, again, that is faithforthecurious.com, so you can find that as well. Of course, we have most of these links up there as well, including we, of course, have a link to your Instagram page where people can follow you as well, and any other social media that people might want to know about. So, first of all, I've always appreciated your writing, and I certainly appreciate the time and energy you put into this book, and I really appreciate you giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Kerby, always good to be with you. Thank you. Appreciate all you.
Let's take a break then, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. And I just thought, once again, I might just remind you that as we talk about some of these issues, you may be trying to figure out, how can I witness to my friends, my neighbors, my coworkers? How can maybe the church be more effective in reaching out? And we want to be a resource in that regard. Let me again mention that if you are a monthly supporter, you'll already receive the Outlook magazine. I'm holding that up, and you'll see me hold it up next hour because we'll be talking about some of the material that will be arriving in your mailbox if it hasn't already. My commentary today is on political realignment, but I'll hold up the booklet I wrote a while back on political realignment, and this commentary actually is different, a little different look at it from a different perspective, so we'll talk about it next hour. But back to this issue of reaching out to our generation. Of course, one of the booklets that we made available a while back, and I'm going to update it very soon, is the next generation. What are those people in the next generation thinking about? Certainly we see the rise of the so-called nuns, people that do not believe in anything, but this whole argument about the spiritually curious overlaps very much with the May issue, which I'm holding up right now, in which we talk about running into people that say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. That's maybe a different kind of category, but I think it overlaps very significantly with these individuals who are either skeptically curious or faithfully curious. And so those are resources as well that we want to put into your hands. We certainly always like to provide those, but as you probably have figured out, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And so if you can help us out financially, that would be greatly appreciated. We have the banner there that says Anchored to Truth. And as we come to the end of our fiscal year, which is June 30th, this in some respects is the most important time for us. Not that December 31st isn't important, but this is important because, number one, it helps us to see how we did in our fiscal year. It helps us to plan during the summer, which sometimes is a downtime of giving, and to really put together a budget that accurately reflects where we are. So your financial involvement is probably more helpful than ever right now. And again, we have a $50,000 match challenge. It's a dollar-for-dollar match. Don't have to wait till June 30th. You could give right now and have that match dollar for dollar. We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you. Now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, and we're going to get into, of course, what is happening in Israel and Iran. And I'm tempted to say, well, that didn't take very long, because now you have different groups within the so-called MAGA movement, even some inside and outside of the Trump administration, disagreeing with each other about what the next step might be. Now, you've got to recognize the first step was taken by Israel, obviously with the consent of President Donald Trump. But where do we go from here? Let's start with first principles, and the first article I have here is by Noah Rothman, which is a reminder of the fact that Israel is remaking the Middle East. I referred to that yesterday, but it's worth getting into in some detail, because there have been some very significant changes, if you will, in the balance of power there in the Middle East over the last 2 or 3 days. And we'll just let his article start the conversation, and then that will lead naturally into some of the intramural battle that is taking place. And that is, he reminds us that it was just a month ago that Donald Trump was looking at Arab world's glittering skylines and declared that this modern marvel could not have been achieved through the application of a Western military power. And, of course, Western military power allowed for the Arab world to flourish. But the point he was making is that I'm not really interested in engaging in a war. It's been pretty obvious that Donald Trump would like to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He would certainly like to have a non-nuclear Iran. But there we go. He then goes into the second paragraph, that is Noah Rothman saying, Israel's military successes since the outset of hostilities with Iran last Thursday are staggering. Let's just give you a little bit of an idea. In the early hours of the campaign, Iran's air defenses, many of which were not repaired after the Israeli Air Force decimated them following an October 2024 missile barrage, which was targeted at Israel, were systematically dismantled both from the air as well as by special forces on the ground. As we've pointed out, 100 different targets in Iran. Let's again remind you that Iran is bigger, for example, than the state of Texas, 1.5 times the size of even Iraq, and I hate to think how many times larger than Israel, but nevertheless, it is one which I think erroneously I said 70 million the other day when I was speaking at church, about 90 million now, and much different for that reason than Iran in Iraq. We went into Iraq. How well did we do? Not so well, did we? With, what were they, about 15 million at the time? We're talking about something that's closer to 90 million. We're talking about a really kind of decimated Iraq after some of that had already taken place from bombings and Saddam Hussein and all the rest. But bombing Iraq back to the Stone Age didn't exactly give us a constitutional democracy in Iraq, now did it? Well, again, the people hoping for some kind of regime change in Iran need to remind themselves of what didn't happen in Iraq. So that's the first issue to put on the table. But nevertheless, gets back to military, because Noah Rothman says in the days since this initial burst of activity, Israel has continued to advance its objectives. The IAF now claims air superiority over the whole of western Iran, from the Iraqi border to the capital, Tehran. Israeli fighters and bombers operate with virtual impunity over the Iranian skies, and many more Iranian nuclear facilities have been disabled. I think the word decimated would be appropriate there as well. So given that, there are some very significant successes and really a remarkable change in power, in the balance of power there in the Middle East. But here's the other issue. Israelis have not yet targeted Iran's political and religious leadership, perhaps as some indicate, due to America, even due to the request from certainly President Donald Trump. And so even though there are reports that we know where the Ayatollah is, that's not been bombed. So now we get to the big questions that involve us. Up until now, we can stand back, we can support what is happening, or we can, as we'll see in just a minute, criticize roundly what is happening. It is amazing that as soon as those first Israeli strikes landed, you had all sorts of people who might be considered anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, I'll let you fill in the blanks, who have been criticizing it. But now Noel Rothman raises the good question I want to get into. We'll probably cover it after the break, and that is, what is the role that the United States will play in this campaign in the coming days? Because if you, again, recognize the decimation of so many of these nuclear facilities, what's left? The hard one is left. That's what's left. For all of Israel's initial successes, the consensus belief is that Israeli forces do not have enough 5,000 pounders. Those are the, if you will, bunker buster bombs to disable the uranium enrichment facility, or Fordo, which persists. This is the one that is located in the mountain. We'll get into that in just a minute. If it remains intact, Noah Rothman points out, Iran will emerge from the war with the capacity to still produce enough fissile material to make several nuclear devices per year. If Iran retains that capacity, Israel's war will have been a strategic failure. So now the question, what, if anything, does the United States do? There are, of course, many who are the conspiracy theorists, and I'm not necessarily discounting them, by the way, because some of these conspiracies turn out to be real, as we've said on this program many times, who are convinced that this might be the pretext to get America involved in some kind of battle with Iran. But let's put that off for just a minute, because, again, Noah Rothman says the bloody nose Iran has already endured, combined with the promise of even more brutal pummeling that will take place, have certainly encouraged the mullahs to sue for peace. This is a quote from the Wall Street Journal yesterday. Quote, Iran has been urgently signaling that it seeks an end to hostilities and resumption of talks over its nuclear programs, sending messages to Israel and the U.S. via Arab intermediaries. So there's where we are at the moment. What should the United States do? This has led to, if you will, a rather significant intramural battle. And so we come back. I want to try to talk about a little of that, put some of that in perspective, give you some perspective, some different viewpoints, maybe dismiss a few that are off the edge here, but nevertheless recognize that the next step may be the most crucial and one that we need to think about with a great deal of wisdom. Hence, those of you that have signed up for our Pray for America, you will be receiving our encouragement for you to pray for wisdom on the part of our leaders. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the common mistakes among Christians is to assume that the future will be merely an extension of the present. We need to understand some of the dynamic changes in our world. That is why I've written 2 books about American realignment and American political realignment. The former looks at demographic and economic changes that have taken place. The latter deals with government and political process. Recently, William Galston wrote about the American political realignment is real. He worked in numerous Democratic presidential campaigns and served as Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy for President Bill Clinton. His commentary to his fellow Democrats is that the Trump election may indeed be political realignment. For example, the Republican Party increased its vote share in 3 consecutive presidential elections in 1,400 counties, nearly half of the national total. By contrast, the Democratic Party increased its share of all 3 elections in only 57 counties. To illustrate the change, he looked deeper at 2 states, Texas and New York. Although Democrats dreamed of turning Texas blue, 124 counties have tilted further right since 2012, while only 2 counties have tilted further left. New York has long been a blue bastion. Nevertheless, 43 of the state's 62 counties showed Republican gains of 10 percentage points or more between 2012 and 2024, and Democrat statewide victory margin shrunk by half. His commentary looks at other changes in the minority votes of Black and Hispanic that show similar shifts. A shift in voting in one election may not mean much, but his analysis suggests a significant shift and realignment in the future. Political candidates need to take note. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, let's see if we can get into a couple of other issues. First of all, let me mention one of the other articles we've posted was so that you could actually hear from Benjamin Netanyahu yourself. This was an interview that Brett Baer did with Benjamin Netanyahu. It's, I think, very easy. It only took me 2 pages to print out, so it's very easy to follow. And I think it really sets forth the argument. One of those questions, of course, was, what have you done to set back the nuclear program? Unless anybody doubts that, here is what Benjamin Netanyahu said. He said, we could wait and wait and wait and string along the negotiations, but we gave them a chance. I gave them a chance, but it was clear they were not serious about it. It became clear, I think, to the United States as well because the president was very clear. He said they could not have nuclear weapons. In order to have nuclear weapons, you cannot have enriched uranium. They basically strung everyone along. It was clear to us that was going nowhere. I could wait and wait and wait until they officially declared the talks were off and we officially declared we were going to attack. That's not how I conduct a war. That's not how Israel conducts wars, and then talks about what they actually did. A little bit later in the interview, and again, we've posted this as the second article so you can read it for yourself in its entirety. He said when they were talking about whether or not they needed a wake-up call, he said, well, we certainly did not need a wake-up call. I've been talking about this threat for 40 years. 3 or 4 years after the Iranian regime, the totalitarian regime, hijacked Iran and its people, I said the greatest threat facing Israel and potentially the world is this regime trying to arm itself with nuclear weapons. I've devoted a considerable part of my life, in fact, most of my life, to preventing that. when the gong of danger sounds and you know it's the last moment, it's the 12th hour, you've got to act. And that's what responsible leaders do. So if nothing else, the argument which was made at the time is we gave them 60 days. 60 days came and went. There was no action at all. There was no seriousness about this. We've been told for many years that Iran is just a year or two away from nuclear weapons. Some of the skeptics have said, yes, they were talking about being a year or two away 10 years ago. So, where is this window here? But you do have the IAEA and others saying that more of this fissionable material is being made available, and the very likelihood of nuclear weapons being used against first Israel and then the United States significant. And so that is indeed the case. This has led to an intramural battle, and it's worth at least mentioning. I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail. This is one thing we try to avoid, whether it's intramural theological battles between different denominations of Christianity or intramural battles between Christian leaders and other Christian leaders. I think that doesn't really advance much and oftentimes tends to be a distraction. In this case, though, an intramural battle sometimes between people in the administration, outside the administration, sometimes within the administration, is significant, if for no other reason than Donald Trump. He was on Monday at the G7 summit in Canada. He basically showed up, was asked to sign a resolution which called for the de-escalation of the tensions between Israel and Iran, said that he maybe had come to some agreement with the UK. We'll have to see it to believe it, but we'll leave it at that, and then leaves. I mean, I think he had dinner and then came back. And, of course, there have been a lot of people noticing that military armament is moving from the United States to the Middle East. We also have one of these like 50-year-old aircraft carriers. There's going to be decommissioned now moving there. A lot of people suggested maybe that would be then something that if it blew up or was attacked wouldn't be a great loss, but it would be if you will, a Gulf of Tonkin justification. Those of you who don't know what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is, look it up on YouTube. You'll get it very quickly. And so, again, at the time when Donald Trump was then urging on social media that everyone in the capital of Iran should evacuate, then you had, of course, the back and forth between him and Tucker Carlson, in which then he on social media says, somebody please explain to kooky Tucker Carlson that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So the back and forth between Trump and Tucker Carlson is one of those. And, of course, you don't know if all of this is a head fake from the president and even maybe from the prime minister of Israel, or just to try to get Iran back to the negotiating tables. But, of course, the one big question is this. You have Fordo, which is a fortified centrifuge, and it is buried deep under a mountain, and that is not going to be easily taken out by Israel. Now, there have been some that say there's a difference between Russia and Ukraine. We don't really have a dog in that fight, although technically we have an alliance and a relationship with Ukraine, and we see Russia as an enemy. True. And that's a little different than Iran, that has been calling for the destruction not just of Israel, but of the United States. And, of course, on these programs, we've had people like Joel Rosenberg and others pointing out that a nuclear Iran may be even more dangerous than a nuclear North Korea for a variety of different reasons. And, of course, you got the point back and forth all over the place as well. Candace Owens, I can't believe I'm quoting her, but get ready, white American men. It's time for you to go and die for Israel. You had, of course, one of the people that Tucker Carlson had on there, Daryl Cooper, who at the end giving consolation, well, don't worry about it. In the end, the devil and all his children are cast in the lake of fire. Well, that's, very true. I've read the last chapters of the book of Revelation, but that doesn't help us right now with some of these really important issues. And, of course, one of the individuals that we have oftentimes interviewed in the past is Tony Perkins, in which he says, look, I'm a Marine veteran, And I'm not an unthinking hawk. I don't believe America should be the world's policeman, nor do I support endless foreign wars. But he also argues that retreating into isolation is not a strategy. It's a gamble we cannot afford. And he is grateful that Israel has reacted. But then the question is, what, if anything, would we be doing in that regard? He does, of course, put one more thing on the table, because all the way back to August 2012, then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who's, of course, no longer in power, but his ilk are still in power, said any freedom lover and justice seeker in the world must do its best for the annihilation of the Zionist regime. And, of course, you can have death to America so many times chanted from the streets of Tehran to remind you that even if we don't see Iran as an enemy, although I think we do, and that, of course, brings us back to the July issue, in which, if you look at this issue here, you see that I show you the picture of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and, of course, the Ayatollah there in Iran. So we recognize this is the new axis of evil. But do we want to engage militarily with that particular situation that has now developed as a war between Israel and Iran? Those of us that remember all the so-called justification for the United States entering into a war of terror with Iraq. Remember, still looking for those weapons of mass destruction. We, again, are going to be a lot more skeptical this time, and should be. And one of the reasons why there are individuals in the so-called MAGA movement saying we don't want forever wars. And so we'll see where this unfolds. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, I suspect you have some opinions, so let's give you that chance to express them. We'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. I do have many other things to talk about, but I also recognize that all of the issues that have unfolded, even the back and forth between Mark Levin and a member of Congress from Georgia, I just have been trying to avoid some of that, but it's in the news, so we need to talk about it as well. But just as we take a break, let me just mention that one of the things we just did a few minutes ago was send out another email from me to you. So if you receive the emails, let me encourage you to read through that, because we remind you that Point of View has been around for 53 years. Got a nice message from David, one of the listeners to Point of View, in which he said, Point of View is the one place I can go and I can hear kindness addressing difficult issues. So many other broadcasters will put people down. You can speak the truth. You can say it in the right way, and that's something I appreciate. I may disagree with some of the rather crass comments being said back and forth right now, but many of those individuals at one time or another have been on this program, and we will treat them with respect, even if we don't appreciate some of the comments being made. That's what we do here at Point of View. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
1972. Point of View was one of a kind, the first Christian conservative talk radio show bridging the gap between biblical values and political action. Over a half a century later, Point of View still stands unique. Consider this testimonial from David, a listener of Point of View. He said, Point of View is the one place I can go that I can hear kindness addressing the difficult issues. You can speak the truth and still say it in the right way, and that's something I appreciate. When you support Point of View, you're equipping Americans to live out their biblical values and to speak truth boldly in the right way. Point of View needs your support right now. Will you donate generously before the end of our fiscal year, June 30th? Give today at pointofview.net or call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or you can just kind of sit back and listen, take some notes, find some of these articles. And I thought for just a minute, I might also mention something else, and that is there are all sorts of people today, including on Breakpoint, talking about the Parental Rights and Responsibilities Act. You might say, that sounds familiar. Yes, because it's still up on our website as a take action item. Turns out, if you go to the piece that just appeared on Breakpoint, that in a letter dated June 1st, several organizations, all under the leadership of Alliance Defending Freedom, you know, when we have Lathan Watts here, Vice President of Alliance Defending Freedom, have urged members of Congress to pass the Family Rights and Responsibilities Act. And so if you go to our website right now, first thing you'll notice is we still have that posted. We're going to change it out, but then we decided, well, just keep it up there for a little bit longer, and I'm glad we did, because here's something I did not know. We did not put in this originally. The organizers chose June 1st because that marked the 100th anniversary of a very important Supreme Court decision. That decision came down, of course, in 1925, because you have to subtract 100. And so in 1925, in June, you have this very famous case of Pierce versus Society of Sisters. Now, if you take any classes in constitutional law, or you've even just gotten involved in any aspect of parental rights, you would recognize that that Supreme Court decision was very important because they acknowledged the parental right to school choice, and basically made the case at the time that parents, not the state, are the final authority for the child's well-being. Matter of fact, Justice Reynolds even said the child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with their high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. So anyway, this is why, in some respects, there was this desire to create this Family Rights and Responsibilities Act. As I've mentioned before, it was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, and also by James Langford from Oklahoma. It was introduced in the House by Representative Virginia Foxx. So you have the information about that on the website. But I thought it was interesting that, just as we have been talking about for the last couple of weeks, the encouragement for you to use the material that we have on our website for our action item, that now today some other organizations are promoting it as well. If you've already done so, well, then you fulfilled your civic duty. If you have not, I thought I'd use this one more possible reminder of that as a very significant issue to pay attention to right here on our website. Let's, if we can, also, as we've been talking about what's going on in Israel, recognize that we do have some biblical quotes that I think have been used, rightly so, to talk about what is our responsibility towards Israel. And a minute ago, I quoted from Tony Perkins in his piece, and he said, let's be clear, America needs Israel more than Israel needs America. I remember when I read that, I go, what? Well, what he said is, by standing with Israel, he says, we unlock the blessings of God. As God promised Abram, or later was known as Abraham, in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So we recognize that supporting the nation of Israel certainly is a blessing. And even if you happen to be one of those Christians that say, well, I don't really think Genesis applies into the church age, I disagree. But even if you accept that argument, you also have to recognize that of all the nations in the Middle East, the one with whom we have the greatest continuity in terms of a belief in freedom, democracy, the right of individuals to have representation. Of course, the fact that we share the Old Testament with Jewish believers, that certainly is the nation of Israel. But one more point, and that is Tony Perkins also quotes from the book of Joel, one of the so-called minor prophets, and in Joel 3 it says, "For behold, in those days and at that time I will gather all nations, and I will enter into judgment with them on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have been also divided up my land." And so, again, this isn't just, I think, applying to the ancient empires, but even, I think, would apply to the modern nations as well. So, again, if you were looking at some verses related to some of this, I thought I might mention those as well. Let's, if we can, maybe change the topic, and that is to recognize that right now we have the issue of deportations, immigration challenge, and the rest. And that brings me to one of the articles I'll get to in just a minute by David Catron. But interestingly enough, I came across this today as well. And that is, you might be familiar with the fact that there has been a real push in the state of Nebraska, primarily in Omaha, Nebraska, and this is where the federal agents used what was called E-Verify to track down more than 100 illegal aliens, obviously using fake IDs. Now, that these were individuals that were challenging them in a meat packer plant, and allegedly some of the illegal aliens pulled out their box cutters. I will leave that at the side because the point I'm making was something else. E-Verify is something we've talked about on this program before. It's meant to screen out individuals who are here illegally. As I've tried to explain before, part of the problem is this. Many people say, well, nobody broke the law other than cross the border. Well, even if you don't consider that to be a crime, and the other day it was amazing how members of Congress are saying, well, that's only a civil action, not a criminal action. So it's certainly a civil offense, not a criminal offense. I bring you back to something we tried to cover a couple of times, and I covered it again Friday when we talked about a couple of times when we mentioned people like Babe Buchanan, who was the sister of Pat Buchanan, who on this program years ago pointed out it isn't just one illegal activity. One illegal activity is like a row of dominoes that leads to another illegal activity and another illegal activity, not the least of which is getting fake IDs, fake Social Security cards, and the rest. And so anyway, the argument is that now this city is going to be in turmoil because the Glen Valley Foods, which actually uses these people who were here illegally for the meat packing plant, they would be totally devastated until you read this story that came out of NBC. Omaha, Nebraska. Every seat in the waiting area of Glen Valley Foods was occupied with people filling out job applications early Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the meat packing plant became the center of the largest worksite immigration raid in the state of Nebraska so far this year. And so one of the commentators, I love what he said, but wait, I was told that companies like this were forced to hire illegal labor force and illegal labor because these jobs are jobs that Americans won't do. Turns out these are jobs that Americans and legal immigrants would be glad to do, and they were in the waiting area of Glen Valley Foods so that they could actually take those jobs on there. You've heard before Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, saying sometimes we actually assume and we even discount the possibility that American workers would like to take these jobs. Now, we recognize some of those American workers are sitting on their couch and they're collecting welfare and they're collecting SNAP, food stamps, and other things. If you put a work requirement in there, they might say, maybe I need to get off the couch and go get a job. And they might actually take some of those jobs. And so here's just one example when we talk about this, then one of the justifications for why we should not be aggressively removing people here who are here illegally is because it's only illegal immigrants that will take those jobs. I point you to at least one story in Omaha, Nebraska, where every seat in the waiting area at Glen Valley Foods was occupied with people filling out job applications, wanting to get one of those jobs at that plant of Glen Valley Foods. So it's one of those, take it for what it's worth, but when we come back, do want to get into this very good piece by David Catron, which is entitled Sanctuary State Confederacy. He sees a real similarity between the Confederacy in the 19th century and kind of a Confederacy today in the 21st century. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, we'll look at our last article here, but I thought to introduce it, I might say that one of the advantages of going to school, especially to graduate school, is that it oftentimes, because the professor forces you to read things that you might not normally read. And I recognize that my friend Charlie Kirk says that college is a scam, and I understand why he says that. But there are times in which school teaching, and of course he's talking about undergraduate, but certainly graduate school, forces you to read some things you wouldn't normally read. And of course, in graduate school, we're reading everything from the Federalist Papers. But one of the things my professor required me to read was a very significant book by John C. Calhoun. Now, I guarantee you, I would not have read something by one of the political theorists of the Southern Confederacy, but he wanted us to read it, if for no other reason, to understand where we came from and where we might have ended up. And you can kind of think of American history in terms of three phases. After the American Revolution, we had what were called the Articles of Confederacy. And the problem with that is every state was completely autonomous, and oftentimes they would have tariffs against each other, trade wars between the states. There was no cohesion. They weren't actually helping even fund the national government as it kind of existed, and wouldn't even pay off some of the debts from the American Revolution. And so eventually, the delegates got together in Philadelphia and wrote the Constitution, which then, for a long period of time, not a real long period of time, but a long enough period of time, was the United States of America. And I emphasize the word states because even then, the federal government was relatively small. The states still had a great deal of autonomy. They made sure that even when they put in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment said that any particular area of power or jurisdiction or authority not specifically given to the federal government was reserved to the states and the people, the 10th Amendment. And so you had a very definite emphasis on United States. After the Civil War, I think it's clear to see that the emphasis changed to the United States of America, and the federal government was much more united even to this day. With that as background, David Cantron notices an interesting irony because he says most Americans think the Civil War was an unambiguous conflict between North and South over slavery. And of course, that's generally accurate. But it was also, here's the word, an insurrection against the federal government committed by 11 states whose Democratic governors and legislators feared that the recently elected Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, would deprive them of their non-citizen labor force. Now, again, you can go into all the other details associated with that, but certainly you then had the Southern Confederacy of 11 states. He goes on to then, in the next paragraph, to say, perhaps because 11 states have lately declared themselves sanctuary jurisdictions while openly defying federal law, ostensibly to protect their non-citizen labor force. Okay, he's having a little bit of fun with them, but he is making a point, and that is if we don't get to the point of saying this is the United States of America, and if indeed we recognize that immigration policy by definition is national, it can't be state, and if we even had a Supreme Court decision ruling against Arizona saying you cannot have your own immigration policy, it is the national policy, and that was due to the fact that Arizona was convinced that at that time President Barack Obama wasn't aggressive enough in terms of border security. You can't turn it the other way around and say, well, we think that President Donald Trump is too aggressive in terms of his immigration policy and border security, and that is the case. And so in some respects, he goes on to say that we've seen some of these governors, and he gives us the list. Of course, you have the California governor, Gavin Newsom. And then he talks about how Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has referred to Trump as a dictator. And then Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has called him a wannabe governor, a wannabe dictator, I should say. And then you even have the back and forth between Representative Elise Stefanik, and that would be the governor of the state of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul, in which each one of them are wanting to say, no, we support the national government, except when we don't support the national government. And then as a result, we want to have special kinds of laws within our states or within our cities that do not allow the federal government authorities to have any kind of jurisdiction. And we won't necessarily say that, so we'll just simply tell local law enforcement and state enforcement not to cooperate with the federal government. And so this is where David Catron says, if you're willing to really be honest, this looks a lot like the Southern Confederacy. He says, if you're thinking that these are ridiculous claims by, for example, J.B. Pritzker and Tim Walz and Gavin Newsom and others, if you think these are ridiculous claims that President Trump isn't a dictator, that doesn't necessarily mean these people are part of sort of an organized confederacy whose combined resistance to Trump's immigration policies and obstruction of federal immigration laws. You're right. But he says, but wait, to coin a phrase, there's more, because now we have a document obtained by the federal government and also obtained by the Heritage Foundation's Oversight Project, which reveals a pact that was put together among 22 blue states and 2 sanctuary cities pledged to collectively prepare potential litigation challenging any effort to curtail birthright citizenship. It was composed and proofed and ready to sign by November 8th, 2024. Of course, as you well know, you have the president signing an executive order limiting executive citizenship, and that is, of course, something making its way through the Supreme Court, which we'll probably talk about by Friday. I suspect that decision will come down pretty soon, but it illustrates again what we have is a group of individuals that are convinced that indeed, as long as we like the policies of the national government, then we will appeal to the national government and even ask the national government to fund the programs that we have. But if we disagree with those policies, in this case, immigration, border security, we will still require that you fund those programs in our states, but we will not cooperate with the national government in any other way. This is different than, of course, the Southern Confederacy, but it has a lot of similarities. And one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is you might remember the speech by the California Governor Gavin Newsom at one point referred to Trump as part of the Confederacy, which takes a little bit of gall when you think about the fact that, if anything, some of these sanctuary states look more like the Confederacy than anything we've had in recent history. Well, that's all we have for today. Let me mention my commentary today is about political realignment. And, of course, we'll be glad to make available to you my booklet on political realignment. Tomorrow we will have our Millennial Roundtable. And then on Thursday, I'm looking forward to this interview I'll be doing with Jeff Shreve. Those of you that listen on American Family Radio would be familiar with him. Looking forward to him being on the program talking about that as well. But first of all, let me thank Doug, who's been willing to sit in this week for Megan, who is out on vacation. Certainly want to thank Steve for sitting in, as he always does, to produce the program. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.